Have you ever loaded up Minecraft and thought, this just isn't the same anymore? Or have you gone back and played an old game that you used to love and then realized, wow, this is actually incredibly shit? That, my friends, is your feeble human brain playing a trick on you. The phenomenon of nostalgia, sentimentality of the past, yearning to return to the good old days. Unlike you, however, my powerful reptilian brain prevents me from having such foolish tendencies, and as such I have never said anything biased about a video game ever. Don't quote me on that. Nostalgia has long been exploited as a piss-easy cash grab across many forms of media. Video games, movies, YouTube videos. One of the most detrimental things about nostalgia, particularly within the games industry, is how it so easily fosters disappointment. Half-Life Alyx, Mountain Blade Bannerlord, Doom Eternal. There are some big-ass games coming out this year that have some big-ass expectations to live up to. Sequels and remakes are some of the most easily marketable games, but they're also subject to some of the harshest criticism. And when you take into account our tendency to hold older titles in a more positive light, along with the expectations we have for modern video game releases, it's easy to see why they're so often lambasted. The role of a video game sequel is usually quite different to a book or movie sequel, which will usually expand upon a story that already exists. While game sequels do sometimes do this, there is a lot more to a video game than just its narrative. Video games are a constantly evolving form of interactive media, and so a video game sequel should do more than just provide a facelift and a change of scenery. They should, keyword being should, always be aiming to improve upon their predecessor and create a different experience that's worth playing, whether that's by polishing or overhauling game mechanics or moving it to a totally different platform or style. Sequels are incredibly attractive for developers to make because they're easily marketable. If you release a game to a very positive reception, naturally a sequel to it will be hyped up before its launch, especially if you leave your audience waiting, clutching at straws for years. Fucking Valve. The same goes for remasters, a far lazier and often more profitable alternative to a sequel. We've seen developers play on our nostalgia for an easy cash grab without really putting anything new into the mix. And then sometimes you get Duke Nukem Forever. However, sequels are open to a whole new avenue of criticism than an original title. Not only are they judged on how good they are as a game, they're also judged on how they stack up to their predecessor. Take Pokémon Sword and Shield. Most of the flack that these games copped was because of the national decks being missing for no apparent reason other than the fact that the Pokémon Company and Game Freak are simply incompetent at both game development and time management, an issue that would be non-existent if it was the first entry to the series. Sometimes the game being criticized isn't even necessarily a sequel. Take Imperator Rome, a game that was also very widely condemned on launch. Technically, it is a sequel to EU Rome, but the game was largely criticized on launch due to its lack of content compared to other Paradox Grand Strategy titles, many of which have been out for years and have been added to with expansions and DLC. But is it wrong to compare it to other titles even if they're not technically in the same series? Should we simply accept that this game was lacking on launch compared to the current state of other Paradox titles, considering we could just play an EU4 mod that does the same thing anyway? When Crusader Kings 3 comes out, it should have at least as much content as Crusader Kings 2 does with all of its DLC. Otherwise, what's the genuine appeal in buying it for existing Paradox fans? A lot of people tend to condemn comparing games to other franchises, and while we may live in the era of incredible video game journalism that compares anything and everything to Dark Souls, games should be kept honest by what is already on the market. While you might say that people are blinded by their nostalgia when it comes to older titles, I think that it's also very important to look back on them with historical context. There's not a lot of point in rubbishing the original Half-Life because it didn't have mocapped facial animations. As time goes on, features that were once considered revolutionary or game-changing have grown to become simply run-of-the-mill and standard. There was a time in which save games didn't exist. Should a game not have them now, it would be crucified. Innovation and improvement are what drives the industry. The technology and the technique get better. Games created now should inherently be of a greater quality than those made in the past, at least on a technical level. But I mean, sometimes we're not wrong about the original game being better. If you're gonna sit here and tell me that RuneScape 3 is better than old school, you can get the hell out of my face. However, when nostalgia comes into the mix, it can complicate things. Sometimes our overestimation of how good an older title was can lead to an underappreciation of a later game in the series. Take Age of Empires 3, a fantastic sequel to Age of Empires 2 by pure definition, and despite what many would say, I think it's a better game too. Age of Empires 3 overhauled many of the mechanics of its predecessor and added more of its own, added a more modern gridless placement and pathfinding system, provided a new time period and setting, and drastically overhauled the game's visuals, yet is regarded as terrible by a majority of Age of Empires fans. Now don't get me wrong, Age of Empires 2 is a fantastic game, but so is number 3, and it has been rubbished seemingly because it tried to do something different. This is where nostalgia becomes dangerous, as it begins to inadvertently stagnate the industry. Rather than trying to create something new and innovative, it can be a safer bet for developers to simply stick with the formula that the audience is used to, or follow the trend of simply remastering old titles. As I said, we should expect games to get better as time goes on, but when you mix that with the tendency to want things to be like they were back in the good old days, is when this becomes very messy. Games are being received poorly because they're too different to the old title, or they're received poorly because they bring nothing new to the table. It's perfectly natural to feel nostalgic about older games, but these feelings can often prove incompatible with having genuine and fair expectations for new titles. The role of the sequel in video games is shifting too. Seeing what Blizzard plans to do with Overwatch 2, sequels are beginning to take on a completely different role, being more like a paid update than a totally new release. And it's not like that's particularly new either. Franchises like Call of Duty have been doing their semi-annual releases for years, and how many times has Skyrim been released now? And don't even get me started on all of the shit that EA's been pulling. FIFA is a clear example of a company simply just not giving a fuck about even trying to put effort into making each iteration of the game genuinely separate from the last, while still maximizing their profits. I believe that a big contributing factor to this change in sequels is the market. Not to go on another of my communistic rants or anything, but this is simply a more profitable method of doing business. I mean, why make all that money from skins and loot boxes in your online shooter and only collect the $60 entry price once, am I right? With this ever-changing definition of a sequel, it's important for us to keep our expectations for video games high and fair as well. We cannot allow the industry to stagnate further, and we have a responsibility to try and keep developers honest. God forbid titles like Overwatch become the new FIFA style of annual $80 installment bullshit. So what the hell do we do? What do we do with our feeble human minds that cause us to be incredibly biased and unfair when we get our hands on a sequel to a game that we loved? Well, we need to acknowledge those biases. We need to not necessarily be more critical of video games, but more critical of how we're critical of video games. Sequels are open to more criticism than new IPs, and they ought to be. A sequel should always prove itself to be more than just a continuation of cash flow. It should justify its existence and aim to improve upon what came before it. But we need to remember that we cannot let our nostalgia get in the way of setting genuine expectations for games or allowing the industry to try new things. We cannot expect the sequel to be the same as its predecessor while also bringing something worthwhile to the table. And we'd be wise to remember that video game nostalgia in particular is very powerful, as games are something that we can really immerse ourselves in, which is what makes it all the more dangerous for setting fair and reasonable expectations for games that are yet to come out. Many retro games that we feel nostalgic for might have been revolutionary for their time, but they would not pull their weight as a modern release. Although you might have fond memories of playing Pokémon Red and Blue, if they were released today, they'd be busted up pieces of garbage. So I guess what I'm actually trying to say with this video is that old school RuneScape fucking sucks.